We'll start out with the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, we'll do a roll call vote.
Chris Rader.
Here.
Dale Howard.
Here.
Ken Cole.
Here.
John Black.
Here.
Julia Petratz.
Here.
Ben Gordon.
Here.
Ken Fisk. Here.
Okay, I'd also like at this time I'm going to read a resignation letter. It is with deep regret that I must tender my resignation from the Planning Commission effective immediately. For personal reasons, I believe that I am unable to fulfill my responsibilities to the Commission and to the Township as a whole. While I was honored to be asked to serve, and not without careful consideration, I feel that I need to step down. I have great appreciation for all of the Township officials, for all of the work that they do, and the many difficult choices that they are faced with. I wish you all well, and may God bless and guide you in your service. Sincerely, Travis Card. Of course, we also lost Carolyn Kelsey here a month ago, so we have 2 vacancies. Anybody interested? Contact the Township Board. At this time, the agenda's in front of you, and I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve this agenda.
Okay, is there support?
Support.
It's been moved and seconded to approve tonight's agenda. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion carried. If you look at last meeting's minutes, see if there's any corrections. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Make a motion to approve the minutes of the July 17th meeting as printed.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve of last meeting's minutes. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion carried. So at this time, we'll have some reports. First up is Dave Kelsey, our zoning administrator. Dave, you have a report?
Two permits for the month of July, and the one was for a variance request, and the other one was land division, and that's it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Next up, our Township Board Liaison, John Black.
The only thing I got, our last board meeting was short and sweet. Phyllis was under the weather, and we had a short meeting, paying the bills, and public hearing. We do have zoning board of appeals. We have 2 cases coming up. There's one Wednesday night dealing with a lot line adjustment, and another one. That will be the following Wednesday, and this,
The other one is just on the setbacks.
okay, on the setbacks around Indian Lakes.
No, in Amber.
Oh, it's in Amble. Okay. It's in Amble. But that's pretty much all I got.
Okay, thanks, John. As far as old business, we had a public hearing here a month ago, and we made a few amendments, and it was sent to the Township Board. First of all, it's got to be sent to the County Planning Commission, and that was recently done. There wasn't any action taken at this last Township Board meeting. Any other old business? Okay, as far as new business, I'd like to introduce Kyle O'Mara. He's an associate with Fahey Schultz, Bursich Roads. And he's going to start out talking about conflict of interest.
Thank you, Chair. Again, my name is Kyle O'Mara. I'm an associate attorney with Fahey Schultz, Bursich Roads, and I represent the township. The township recently received a correspondence from an attorney, Josh Nolan, related to conflicts of interest. It is my understanding that this correspondence will be made available to the Planning Commission to review as well, and also to the Township Board. Given the correspondence related to conflicts of interest, I think it actually is a very good and important reminder for the Planning Commission and for the board to be cognizant of potential conflicts of interest. I will say that I probably agree with about 90% of Mr. Nolan's letter, although I do have some, I'll say, distinctions from his letter. Given the circumstances of a potential wind project, that is a situation that can be ripe for conflicts of interest under a variety of authorities. The biggest of them being essentially, or the biggest reason why it can be ripe for conflicts of interest are wind projects involve a lot of land, and they also involve a lot of people. And they typically are in smaller communities where people will be related to other people who may have an interest in a particular development or a particular project. So given the importance of conflicts of interest and how they apply to the Planning Commission and Township Board, I'd like to go through the areas of law that govern conflicts of interest in Michigan to help remind the Planning Commission and the Township Board of how conflicts of interest work, as well as more or less to at least provide this information to you, and then also to emphasize that if you believe you do have a potential conflict of interest, I do know that conflicts of interest are generally very personal matters, that it would be my opinion it would be a good idea if you think you have potential conflict of interest to either address that with me or the supervisor so we can provide some assistance to navigate whether that potential conflict of interest is an actionable conflict of interest or a non-actionable conflict of interest. So with that being said, there are a number of authorities that govern conflicts of interest for elected and appointed officials. What I would say the main one is, or the overreaching one that applies to all appointed and elected officials, is the general fiduciary duties that a elected or appointed official has to the township. In other words, this means that for all decisions that you are working on or deliberating, you should always be working to benefit or make decisions in the best interests of the township and not for yourself. So this stems from a variety of case law going back as far as to the 1800s. as well as being recited and being applied in case law that is more recent in the 2000s. So the general gist of fiduciary duties is you have to act in the best interest of the township. Your decision should be in the best interest of the township. And if you believe that you have some influence that is making you act in personal interests for a matter that may be in front of you, then it would be my opinion you should recuse yourself from deliberation in that matter, as well as not participate in any voting. Along the lines of fiduciary duties, with case law that cites fiduciary duties, there is also the concept of what I will call, for lack of a better words, remote interest. So there's a string of cases, including cases the case that's cited by the Michigan Supreme Court, that talks about how there is essentially sometimes performing duties of public concern maybe have some sort of remote interest, such as legislative duties, that may impact you in some ways, and it's generally the policy of a Republican government to select officials as agents and representatives for the township and to avoid the absurd result of more or less any time that there is an interest that you may or may not have with a decision or item that comes before you that would not require you to recuse yourself. An example I'll give for this is the Planning Commission and the Township Board may consider zoning ordinance amendments related to, let's say, single-family dwellings. And let's say there's a potential zoning amendment that would relate to reducing setbacks for those dwellings. Well, in most cases, that could technically benefit someone because the setback would be reduced. You would have more ability to use your land. But the principle there is more or less that interest is remote. It's a legislative duty, and that should not essentially bar you from working on a matter related to a remote interest. So the general gist of fiduciary duties is it's somewhat of a, I don't want to say the common sense rule, but it somewhat is the common sense rule of making sure that you are acting in the best interest of the township. If you have something that will bind yourself to not acting in the best interest of the township, or you cannot act in the best interest of the township, whether it be, and I know we're talking about discussing a potential zoning ordinance amendment related to wind. If you believe you have something that will make you not act in the best interest of the township, you should abstain from deliberation before voting on that matter. The next source of authority is what is called, and let me get what I call generally, the Standards of Conduct Act. It's a statute that Mr. Nolan has cited in his letter as well. It's the full name is the Standards of Conduct for Public Officers and Employees Act. I do have some minor distinctions from what Mr. Nolan said in his letter, primarily, and they're not, I think, important distinctions, but I believe his letter says that should not apply to the Planning Commission. In my opinion, it does apply to the Planning Commission because it applies to public officers, and that definition includes appointed officials, which would be all of you. The second distinction I have, and this is just a technical point as well. What I'll reiterate is don't violate the Standards of Conduct Act, but at the same time, I believe his letter says that there's criminal penalties in the statute. The statute only has civil penalties, which should not matter to all of you, but it's a distinction that I think you should be aware of when you review his letter. So the Standards of Conduct Act generally goes through a variety of different statutory prohibitions on voting or deliberating on matters. And I'll give you a few examples of these. So one, you should not accept any gifts or loans or loans, goods, or anything of value for basically a gift from something that you will be considering or may influence your decision making on a future decision that you may make as a member of the Planning Commission. So in the context of wind, I would strongly encourage you not to accept gifts from any potential developer, just to avoid basically violating that provision. The second is not engaging in business transactions where the employee may profit from his or her official position or of authority. The important thing for all of you to know is one that an ordinance amendment generally is the planning commission makes a recommendation right to the township board. So this may not be triggered by potentially going through a wind ordinance. The other thing that should be basically known is the Standards of Conduct Act, among other things, is one, I am not aware of a case that has applied this to local officials, a published case at least. And then the second, so there's not much guidance other than what the statute says. And then the second is for state employees, there is what is called a state ethics board that comes up with more or less interpretations of this act for individual scenarios. And there are a variety and a string of state ethics opinions that go back to when I was talking about fiduciary interests, of when you may have a remote interest in something that you're voting on, or it may remotely impact you. And there's an example of a state ethics opinion where a commission is formed of a number of professionals in a certain subject area, a state commission, and they vote on rules generally that govern a particular industry. And that may impact the rules that they're voting on, or that they're discussing, may impact businesses that they work for, because the board needs to be composed of experts in that particular industry. They have that particular ethics opinion, which again would not be binding, but I believe it would be persuasive, essentially says that when it's a legislative task that may have remote interests, as long as those remote interests do not violate your fiduciary duties to a township, that would not arise to an actionable violation of this act. The second is number 7. This is the biggest one that comes up almost time and time again. So it's my understanding that there is no application right now for a wind development, but let's say there were. The last sub 7 of the Standards of Conduct Act discusses that a public officer or employee shall not participate in the negotiation of, or basically issuing permits when a public officer or employee has a financial or personal interest. So if you were to have a lease with a particular wind developer and they had a zoning application in front of you, it would be my opinion that this provision would bar you from deliberating or voting on that particular application, as unless something called the rule of necessity applies, and I will talk about that in a short bit. So that's the Standards of Conduct Act. So that's your second layer. So you have your first layer, which is all encompassing of the fiduciary duties that you have to the township related to conflicts of interest. Then you have the Standards of Conduct Act. Then there's more. You have planning commission members. You have bylaws that discuss more or less what would constitute a conflict of interest, and the Planning Enabling Act states that you should not vote on or participate in matters where you have conflict of interest. But interestingly, the Planning Enabling Act does not define conflict of interest. Also interestingly, there is no case law citing that provision, at least to my knowledge. There is a similar provision in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act related to conflicts of interest for a zoning board of appeals. In one case that I found, they discussed, it appears that I believe it's a township, did not define conflict of interest. So the court was looking at secondary authority, more or less judicial ethics guidelines, to determine should a planning committee or a zoning board of appeals member recuse themselves from a vote where I believe it's a nephew was on the ZBA, and then I think his uncle was the applicant. In that case, they said no, but so there's limited guidance in law. So that is why the more or less the Planning Enabling Act allows you to adopt bylaws. So you have a current set of bylaws, and it's my understanding that the township has asked for assistance for us to look at those bylaws. What I will typically say to you for bylaws is most bylaws that you'll see throughout townships in Michigan relate specifically to, there's a number of ways how they define conflict of interest, but they relate specifically to zoning requests that come in front of the Planning Commission. And if you look at, for example, the Michigan Townships Association's model bylaws, that's what they relate to. And then they have a catch-all, which comes from the Planning Enabling Act, that says if a majority of the Planning Commission believes that there is a reasonable conflict of interest, that they can essentially prohibit one of their members from considering or working on a matter. So that is your bylaws. So that would be your third layer, and then and I promise this is getting close to the last layer, is the administrative policy. So the Winfield Township somewhat uniquely has a administrative policy. Section 3.11 governs your ethical standards in the township, and it has a number of provisions. So the first is essentially that you need to act in the best interest of the township. That, in my opinion, is memorializing your fiduciary duty to the township. The second is you should not participate in a decision or transaction on behalf of the township that would result in a direct financial benefit to themselves. Again, I think that goes into, there's provisions in the Standards of Conduct Act as well as fiduciary duties that would address the same. I believe it's important to realize it says direct financial benefit to themselves. I think this would also align with, let's say you have a wind lease and there is a zoning application, that you should not participate in a decision related to that wind lease. Third, you have a duty under these administrative guidelines to notify the township board immediately if an official believes that they face a potential conflict of interest. And that's what I'd encourage all of you to do, especially because, one, I know conflicts of interest are private, and then two, they are very fact specific to see if you have an actionable conflict of interest, whether you need to recuse yourself or whether you can choose to recuse yourself. And it's often best to have some of those discussions with counsel involved and to help navigate that process. The last would not, the fourth provision would not apply to the Planning Commission. Then the last is you should not accept gifts from an entity soliciting township business. Again, that is conduct prohibited in the Standards of Conduct Act. So, with that being said, the last item I want to briefly touch on is what is called the rule of necessity. So, with knowing that, I want to basically say is there is something out there called the rule of necessity. It comes up a lot in wind projects, and it comes up a lot, particularly in wind projects, because a majority of Planning Commission members will have a conflict of interest that would be actionable under bylaws. So typical bylaw provisions in Michigan, and what you'll see in the examples from the Michigan Townships Association and maybe elsewhere, is they'll say you have a conflict of interest if a neighbor has basically they're part of the request. So let's say you have a neighbor who has signed a wind lease. If you have a relative who is part of the request, so let's say you have in a smaller community, one of your direct relatives is part of the request. And in many cases, you'll get to a point where everybody has a conflict, and typically under a conflict, you recuse yourself and you abstain from deliberating or voting. But let's say out of, I know we have 7 here right now, but out of your Planning Commission, you only have 2 left that don't have conflicts. What courts have said is that would be an absurd result, because you cannot conduct business that you're required by statute to do, which would be considered, let's say, a zoning application. And there's a process under the Rule of Necessity as well as the Standards of Conduct Act that allows basically each member to disclose any personal conflicts that they may have before the matter is before them, affirm that they can act in the best interest of the township, so that relates back to your fiduciary duties, and then you would be able to participate. But if you absolutely cannot act in the best interest of the township, you should absolutely not participate in the matter. So I know that was a lot. That's a short summary of conflicts of interest. The biggest one, I think, for all of you to consider is your fiduciary duties to the township right now, especially when you're performing legislative acts or potential legislative acts of considering a wind ordinance. And I'm available to answer any questions if anyone has a question. If if people would like to talk to me after a meeting or arrange a time to discuss potential conflicts of interest, I'm also happy to do so then.
All right, thank you, Kyle. Anybody on the committee have a question for him? All right, we'll move into the wind ordinance that was proposed about a year ago. Kyle is gonna kind of go through a few of the highlights, and after that, we'll have some discussion on that.
Thank you, Chair. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but it has been nearly a year. Our office was asked by the township to essentially work off of a model that has been used in elsewhere of a wind ordinance. And not to say that this is where the Planning Commission will end up, but we have adjusted provisions that would reflect basically incorporating the amendment in the township zoning ordinance. My intent and my thought of how you can work through this process, because it's been quite a long time since one that we transmitted this proposed draft to you, and second that you have received a variety of public input and communications, and I'm sure you will continue to do so, is to go through what I would say the key provisions of this ordinance, and then if any member of the Planning Commission wants to talk about a specific issue, we can talk through some of those specific issues as they relate to your community. And after that, I believe we can work on somewhat of if there needs to be further study into other issues, or if you have questions for me generally of what I've seen in other wind ordinances. I've worked on a variety of projects, or renewable energy projects, kind of going in both directions and reflecting the needs of very different communities. So I'm pretty, I would say, pretty versed in these typical ordinance provisions that regulate wind energy. And I can tell you different approaches that have worked elsewhere, or that have been used elsewhere at least. And then I think we can go from there to see where the Planning Commission would like to end up. So does everybody have a copy of what was initially proposed around a year ago? Or that was transmitted to us, to the township a year ago? If not, okay. Is everybody ready? Perfect. So here and I'll start on, I think the best way to do this honestly is to go page by page. And I'll go what I think are the highlights of this ordinance that we were asked to adjust for the township, to incorporate, or to basically modify it so it would be acceptable to put into the zoning ordinance, knowing that there could be further change, that there could or would be further changes and input from the public. Is the first thing it would do, it would make a wind energy facility, so generally a wind project, special land use in the agricultural district. Going on to page 2, there are a number of definitions. I won't go through all of these definitions. What I'll do is 2 and 3. What I'll do is I'll talk about what I consider key points of a wind ordinance. So key points of a wind ordinance to me are generally noise, shadow flicker, setbacks, decommissioning, and then if they use some of these terms, I'll help explain what they mean. So third is on page 3 at the very bottom, it talks about how that you will need a special land use permit and site plan approval for a wind project, which is called a wind energy facility in this draft. In addition, there will be a number of different application materials. Going through here of note that I would consider some of the more important materials is drawings that show the design of towers and removal of towers, allowing restoration of soil to the depth of 4 feet. That is important for decommissioning. Basically, that these types of projects typically have a lifespan of some certain time, so it's very important for the Planning Commission and the township to consider what exactly happens at the end of the life of the project, and how can we ensure, if there were a project, and this is a big if there were a project, what would how would the project be decommissioned, or how can the township be ensured that, or basically confident that the project would be removed at the end of its life. Going on, I'm on page 4, looking at the bottom. There's a requirement to show evidence with a number of state and federal laws, regulations, and statutes. Going on to 5, where it says C. Basically, this is important. So number 2, C2, talks about how wind turbines should not be artificially lit except for the extent required by the FAA or other applicable authority. It's been, at least my experience recently, that there has been some advances in lighting management for wind developments, one of which is called an aircraft detection lighting system. This particular ordinance does not specifically require that, but that's something to consider. Going on to D, and this is probably where we'll see most of our discussion, or the Planning Commission's discussion, may come from, is setbacks. So right now, the setbacks in this draft ordinance discuss that that basically a turbine has to be set back from the greater of 2 times its hub height. So hub height is from the base of the turbine to the hub where the blade spins, or 1,000 feet.
Wow.
The second is shadow flicker. So shadow flicker in this draft that was incorporated, that they were asked to incorporate, what talks about no more than 30 hours of shadow flicker a year for an occupied building. Going to property line setbacks, we're moving on to 5, where it says 3. Turbines shall not be located within 1.5 times of hub height of the property line of a non-participating lot. So that is something that we typically see different setbacks of varying different distances and ordinances that I've seen for those who would be non-participating. So those who would not have signed a wind lease for it with a developer if there were to be a project. Again, this is number 4 on 6 basically encompasses that. Then there is number 5 on page 6, public roads shall be set back from public roads at a distance no less than 400 feet or 1.5 times hub height, whichever is greater.
Wow.
Going to railroads or rails to trails, not sure if there are too many of those here, but it's the same setback
Yes, there
standard.
are.
So those are the setbacks that are in this particular draft ordinance. One thing that, given that the township does have lakes within it, that's one thing that the Planning Commission may want to consider, whether lake setbacks would be appropriate. Moving on further, the current noise decibel limitation is essentially 55 decibels at the habitable structure closest to the wind project.
Wow.
If the ambient sound pressure would exceed 55 decibels, the standard would be ambient plus 5 dBA. That's when you think of wind projects, you typically will hear shadow flicker, setbacks, and noise. Going further, 6I, this is something to just keep in mind. So this basically says that a wind energy facility cannot be installed somewhere that would disrupt basically communications. So if someone uses antenna for TV service, that's something that I've seen be an issue for some projects where there would be potential blockage of reception, and in some instances requirements to fix that blockage of reception. Going on towards page 7, let's see if there's anything that I think is important here. If you go to page 7 and you go towards the top where it says transportation, it requires a transportation plan and approval by appropriate authorities, which I would say would be the County Road Commission in most cases. This is important for if there were to be a project, the transportation plan to know how construction of the project would happen, but probably more importantly is in many projects that I've been involved in, if a project were to be approved, that you would want to make sure that there would be some sort of agreement by the County Road Commission as well as whoever is building the project to basically post some security that would allow restoration of roads if they were to be degraded during the construction process. Application fee, I think that's pretty straightforward. Going on to page 7, I believe that's self-explanatory. I think I went through earlier that the wind energy facility would be subject to the special land use permit and site plan review process that is more spelled out in your zoning ordinance. This is a big one. Going on to page 8, decommissioning. So decommissioning in wind projects is extremely important because you want to make sure that there is a ability to ensure that if there were to be a project, that the project was basically removed by either the operator or the applicant. And if it wasn't removed after its lifespan, to ensure that you don't have basically abandoned infrastructure in your township, that there would be what is called a decommissioning agreement between an entity and the township that would specify certain terms. And what I've seen is, when a turbine has stopped working for 6 months or some period of time, that it would be determined to be abandoned, and there would be a process of, does it need to be fixed, et cetera. But at the end of that process, there would be a provision that would allow the township to generally draw from what would be in most cases, a bond. If the developer were, again, or the operator were not to decommission it themselves, there would be the ability for a financial, basically finances, and generally in the form of a surety bond, to pull from to decommission, so the township could decommission that component itself or the project itself. So it's very important to make sure that that is more or less encompassed in any wind ordinance. And then you have at 8 and 9 something that can sometimes be overlooked, and I did double check your ordinance before this meeting today, is there are utility wind turbines, and then there's also what are small wind turbines that a farm may have, and it may be a personal turbine. So that this spells out some regulations related to max height of what would not be a utility scale turbine. I know I went relatively quick through that, and I just addressed the highlights. There are many other things I could talk about, and I could honestly talk about this for quite some time, but I think it would be helpful if the Planning Commission were to see if they have any questions about individual provisions, or see if they would like to see if I have any thoughts of how to address certain issues that are specific to your community, because every community is different and has its own unique needs and wants, and different stakeholders. So they're generally some ordinances may work very well in certain places, but then they may not work in another community unless it has some sort of tweaks.
I guess I'll go first. I have a question in regards to Winfield Township. Has a lot of, it's a lot different than Gratiot County. We don't have a lot of flat, open ground. We got swamps, lakes, woods. I guess in your experience, what do you see as far as I'm thinking it would be good to have for lakeside residential, some sort of a setback. We've got 2 lakes in our township. I guess what do you see, or what have you seen?
So, Chair, that's a very good question. I've seen a number of different approaches. One approach would be a purely kind of, what I would say, a foot value, that a turbine needs to be away from a lake, and it should be measured at the edge of the lake. I've also seen in different zoning ordinances, let's say as part of their application materials, a requirement to provide renderings of what a proposed project would look like in the horizon. And the typical thing you see with lakes is you do not want or residents may essentially say that they do not want views disturbed by turbines, their lake views, and that's something you could require to show, what it would look like in the horizon from certain areas around lakes to help inform decision making to ensure that you are not, if you're considering a project, that you're not harming the aesthetics of an area. So that's the second thing I've seen. Third thing I've seen is, I know right now it talks about how this draft makes it basically a wind project, a special use within the agricultural district. You could form what is called an overlay district, so you would not be working within your agricultural district, but you would set a defined area of the township that could be subject, where these types of improvements could occur, which could be modified or exclude some areas around lakes. A sort of off-the-wall thing I've heard of, I haven't seen it myself, but I know other attorneys at our firm have seen it, is there are, for some land uses, at least I've heard of this, that outside of the rendering requirement, there has been instances that someone would put like a red weather balloon at a certain height to see from a particular area whether you could see that red weather balloon or not, to help determine the aesthetic values that the turbine may have on it, like a horizon view or a sunset view near a lake. So that's a number of things. What I typically see is a foot setback from certain lakes. The most, I think, controversial aspect of that is you tend to have to require to determine which lakes are lakes in the definition of that. I believe Winfield Township has Winfield Lake and Indian Lake, and there may be more, so that's sometimes a point of contention of what lakes and what technically qualifies as a lake. And sometimes that might be why you may want to go with an overlay district.
I guess to ask more about that question on lakeside residential, you mentioned starting the setbacks from the water's edge. Well, some of our lakes have lakeside residential that may go back maybe as much as a half mile or more and still be in lakeside residential. Would you not think that we should stay back from the residential part of it and not just the lake? That's my question.
So that's a very good question, and it's generally a question of policy, right? So I'm not, the policy maker, and every community is different, and that's the unfortunate part is you are somewhat in the tough job. So yes, you could do it from the end of, you could absolutely do it that way. Not the problem, but you would have to determine where that begins, where that area begins, and you may want to, sometimes, so from a practical thing, when you're practically thinking of a zoning ordinance and how to apply a zoning ordinance, you like a lot of certainty. So edge of a lake is pretty certain. There's mapping. Once you say the edge of the residential, you have to determine what is the edge of the residential. So in the context of a zoning overlay district, you could solve that problem because you would have basically the boundaries from that overlay district to work from. If you just have text that says at the end of the lakefront residential, then you're going to get into issues of interpretation of what the end of the lakefront residential is.
In setting up an overlay district, would you actually use physical boundaries as roads and, obviously a physical boundary?
So you could, I mean, what the cool thing about overlay districts is you could really use basically anything as your boundary. I mean, you could draw it on top of, you know, let's say a section map of the township and determine where you find things appropriate. It's almost like your zoning map. Your zoning map may, you know, shows the agricultural district and it has, you know, certain boundaries and it may not align perfectly with roads. So you have flexibility to really do more or less what you would like to do if you went in the direction of an overlay district.
So it sounds like an overlay district. In this regard, we call it a turbine district, and it would overlay mostly ag district, but possibly other stuff. But
That's
what it sounds like.
That's absolutely correct. That's one approach you could use, or you could use the approach that has been initially put in this ordinance, where you have it basically working with your current zoning districts. It's an overlay district. It's almost like you're creating a zoning district exactly as you said for one use.
But it overlays ones that are existing.
Correct.
Chris, are you looking to go through all these, just like we did the last time with is that what you're thinking?
Well, I don't think we'll get through it all tonight, but at least get through few topics here. Will we talk about setbacks or noise or,
I mean, we'd automatically add the new technology for the blinking light, wouldn't we?
right?
I mean, what do you got, you need a motion for that, or?
So it would be my opinion that the planning commission, if they came to consensus on something, so you don't necessarily need a motion, but as long as, you know, all of you agree with it, I think that would be something I could put on the list that we could modify the draft to incorporate.
And that's pretty much a given on that one, right?
What's the definition, or what do they call it?
They call that an aircraft detection lighting system, and it's my understanding that in Gratiot County, in North Shade and New Haven townships, that they currently have one in place. So it's a system that when airplanes aren't nearby and by nearby, whatever the specifications are of the particular system, that the red flashing lights would not be on.
Was there a backup failure to it?
So, so what I've been explained at least is that it is, so the FAA, I believe, has approved maybe 4 of them for use, and there's pretty rigorous testing, and I think it will err on the side of caution more than keeping them off. It's a relatively new technology. I won't say it's brand new, and there is at least one instance that I'm aware of it being implemented in Michigan and relatively nearby.
I guess another one, this one, currently the draft as far as noise, 55. I think we've done some research and I think we can probably lower that to 50, maybe even 45. I think we did something pretty similar in the solar. But
I agree with you.
you got a consensus on that, or
Yeah.
you want to go to 50 or 45?
45.
I say match the solar, it's about 45 in the solar, I say match it.
But where's that at?
So that
I
would
mean,
be-
how far from Where do you measure that from?
In this particular ordinance, if you go to, and pardon me for, I believe it's measured from an occupied building, but I'll have to double check. If you go to page, I believe, 6, number, or letter G, above, so 55, at habitable structure.
Absolutely.
So that 45 is at the nearest habitable structure.
That's how it read, correct, yes.
So I believe our solar ordinance has changed to 45, that's from the property line, L10 to the maximum of 1 occurrence per day, meaning that it cannot exceed, an average of 45 more than once a day, for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is how, and I think we may have discussed this at the solar meeting, but, how is that addressed if it does go over? I think we talked about, or Anthony Warren talked about it being unlikely to happen unless there's some sort of malfunction or something, where I believe with wind turbines, it's much more, it will happen. I guess I wanna know how we address that.
So that's a very good question. So there are, and this actually leads into a few things that I think you could potentially do to enhance this model. Is one, typically you would want to at least start with a complaint resolution process that you would have, that you would require a developer or operator to use, and essentially that it would be basically public knowledge that you're publicly available, that residents could submit complaints to the operator of the project to address whether, let's say there is a potential noise violation, that could be basically addressed internally. Because there is some, in many instances, there actually is an incentive for the operator to fix that, because they would be, let's say there was and this is a bunch of what ifs, but if there were to be a project approved, if they're violating performance standard of an ordinance, technically you could institute actions to revoke their special land use permit and prevent them from operating. So that would be the first one. And the second practical reason is many townships will lack the resources of having, and believe it or not, it's very expensive to accurately measure sound. In most cases, and I think a lot of times, like a developer will tell you this, well, you can't use your phone decibel reader, that's not accurate. So you want to rely at least on some of the expertise that they may have. The second thing you could do to ensure that is, so you have complaint resolution process, I would recommend that those complaints would be transmitted somehow to the township, to at least so it's aware, that the township would be aware of complaints that are happening. The second way to mitigate against that is you could have a requirement for a post-construction sound study, and potentially sound studies at certain intervals of time. So what that is essentially doing is, so in my experience, when there's applications for these types of uses, they will have sound models that show where the decibel basically levels are in areas of the township. A post-construction study would put a requirement on an applicant to conduct a study of certain areas in a township of what the sound level is reading at, and so you have actual data, right, to do that. And you could have, and this is again getting a little bit far afield, but let's say you have a planner, engineering firm assisting the township with processing all these applications. They could review that report, or you could have the township get its own third-party report. So that's post-construction sound studies, and then you could have, let's say every 5 years, a requirement to produce another study with potentially measuring at different locations. So they're generally not going to measure at every single occupied building in the township, because that would be in most instances cost prohibitive. But you would have kind of a randomized or an item to see if the model that they have provided to you is working. So that would be the second way you could guard against that. The third way you could work with that is there's something called a continuing ordinance enforcement escrow account. So you could require in your zoning ordinance the ability for a continuing escrow, which that means essentially funds to address complaints that relate to that ordinance violation. So let's say an alleged sound violation. And that would allow the township to draw from that account to address complaints. Let's say if the complaint resolution process does not work, or there's disputes of the remedy of the complaint resolution process, the township could independently hire an expert to determine the veracity of a particular complaint related to sound.
So do we write that stuff in right now, right here? I mean,
What?
this- Go ahead.
No, go. No.
Well, this is one of those points that we don't wanna have to fight the end owner of the turbine about any of this. You know, they're bigger than we are. How do we make this to where we win without having to put a bunch of money into it if we come to a disagreement about something, especially when there's a resident that's putting up with noise that's against the ordinance. And we have a turbine operator of the company that doesn't care.
Amen.
Yeah, so the proposals that I suggested would not be funded directly by the township. It would be required that the operator would fund those, that the township would independently select an expert using basically their money, but it would be in an escrow account. So it would not be the township's resources working towards that. I think you make a very important point that there is an element of continued compliance for these types of projects, and you need to make sure, and you absolutely do not want to fight about this later on down the road. So that's why I suggest if there were to be a project, you would want to make sure that the application materials are very well and thorough. You would want to generally hire a planner or engineering firm to evaluate those, especially when it relates to sound and shadow flicker, to determine that the modeling is okay. And then you have checks. The checks would be, potential post-construction studies. A check would be an ordinance escrow account that you would not be using, enforcement escrow account that you would not be using township money, but you would be using applicant or operator money to investigate complaints that are not resolved by the complaint resolution process.